watching Canadian Muslim News on Muslim Network TV from Toronto, Ontario. I'm Catherine Bullock. Assalamu alaikum and greetings of peace. What are the similarities and differences between international human rights law and Islamic law? We will talk to lawyer and visiting scholar SHAHAB SAQIB. But first, some news headlines. Poll shows Quebec government in lead ahead of vote. Series Dreams in Vantablack features black youth poets. Palestinians protest Israeli settler intrusions in Al-Aqsa. India declares Muslim organisation a major threat. And now the details. A new study by Angus Reid shows that Coalition Avenir Quebec, or CAQ, is leading the top 5 contenders in the upcoming Quebec elections. The findings show that 1 in 3 Quebecers support the CAQ and show a willingness to vote for the party on October 3rd. 1 in 5 support the Conservative Party. 16% of Quebecers say they will vote for either Quebec Solidaire or the Liberal Party, while 12% show support for the Parti Québécois. The CAQ is performing well on 2 key issues, healthcare and the economy. Canadian poet Ian Ketaku's new venture with CBC Gem titled Dreams in Vantablack is based on the poems of 12 black youth between the ages of 9 and 20 from across Ontario. Black animators worked alongside the young poets using 2D animation and other technology to bring life to the anthology series. Topics explored include identity, mental health, racism, and bullying. Furkan Mohammed, an 18-year-old black Muslim poet, says to local media that working with the animators, quote, took me aback because she met people who empathized with her experience rather than feeling alone. Vantablack is a coating that absorbs 99.96% of light. The show starts streaming on September 29th. Palestinians protested in Gaza City today against Israeli settler intrusions into the Al-Aqsa mosque complex in occupied East Jerusalem. The Israeli occupation army stormed the complex yesterday so that Jewish settlers could enter the mosque to celebrate the Jewish New Year. A media source reports that the soldiers were heavily armed. They barred the entry of Muslims under the age of 40 into the mosque. A spokesman of Hamas's student wing, which organized the protests, says that Palestinians reject Israeli raids on the Al-Aqsa mosque. Israel occupied East Jerusalem, where Al-Aqsa is located, during the 1967 Arab-Israeli War. It annexed the entire city in 1980, in a move never recognized by the international community. The Indian government has declared the Popular Front of India, or PFI, and its affiliates, quote, an unlawful association with immediate effect for 5 years. The action against the Muslim organization under a stringent terror law comes after the government accuses the PFI of having links with terrorist outfits, a charge denied by the organization. The police carried out raids across several states and arrested dozens of its members. A Gazette notification states that the group has become a major threat to the internal security of the country. The organization, formed in 2006, calls itself a neo-social movement that strives for the empowerment of marginalized sections of India. And that's it for the news. Islamic law is often seen as out of date, out of step with the modern world, and in need of an overhaul. Our next guest is doing a very interesting comparative study looking up some similarities as well as differences between Islamic law and international human rights law. We're going to be talking to SHAHAB SAQIB, who is an attorney, but also a PhD student in King's College London, now a visiting scholar at U of T School of Law in the Institute of Islamic Studies. Welcome to the show. Assalamu alaikum.
Wa alaikum salam. Thank you so much for the introductions, Katie.
You're very welcome. International human rights law and Islamic law. What are you finding?
I mean, it's a project which started off as just curiosity. So I started build up a comparative study of international human rights law and Islamic law because both systems claim to be universal. And I was looking particularly at discrimination and how the conceptualization of belonging and identity worked in both systems. And the more I researched, the findings were quite surprising because the otherness in both systems were working quite similarly sometimes, but there were some striking differences as well. So
we'll get into all of those, but the Islamic law is considered by those who don't study it, I suppose, to be just generally discriminatory, full stop. So they might even find it weird that you're comparing it to the concept of otherness in international human rights law. Can you just touch on that a little bit more?
Indeed, it is. It is considered like blatantly discriminatory. But what I was looking at was that the boundaries of what classifies as discrimination and what classifies as legitimate differences, it is itself blurred, right? So when it comes to Islamic law, many practices are just classified as discriminatory. But in international human rights law, those are just known as legitimate differences. So it was just about classifying one thing with the other. So when I started comparing, things starts to become prominent.
So make this real for us. What differences? Let me say that again. When we talk about discriminating, but it's considered legitimate in international human rights law, what are we talking about?
So citizenship is the biggest otherness in international law. As a matter of fact, international human rights law call non-citizens as aliens, which I think is a derogatory term for calling them. And on that basis, there are many legitimate differences which are legitimized in human rights treaties, on the basis of which you can treat others differently. States can treat others differently. Human rights committees are treating others differently.
Give us some examples, please.
So, one of the famous cases in Diop versus France, a Senegalese citizen applied for bar membership in France. And the case was that he fulfilled all the requirements and the French government didn't allow him to be accepted. And when the case went to the French government, eventually the French government surprisingly argued that we are not discriminating against him because he's Senegalese, but we are doing it because he's not French. And the Committee on the Elimination of All Forms of Racial Discrimination, and it's surprising, it says all forms. It says it's justified because it's based on the basis of citizenship. And there are many other cases which come under this big bracket.
Well, we did an interview yesterday with someone who's advocating for temporary foreign workers to have rights of citizenship. So it's something that we know and experience, but we probably don't think of it in that way. What have you learned about Islamic law then in that regard?
Indeed, I think, the more I started thinking about it, I think it's more about our social consciousness, the way we think about others. And I think international law is kind of or modern nations are kind of dominating in that sense, because they have made us think in that way about the other. But when it comes to Islamic law, I think Islamic law is quite blatant in this regard. The entire foundation is that if you believe in one God, you are the one who's going to go to heaven, and if you don't, the God will punish you, and that's the foundation. So I think there was some sort of transparency in terms of Islamic law, which actually I liked. In international human rights law, I have to search through it, and I would say it was dissimulated in a sense. It was concealed, but again, this is what I found when I was comparing one system with the other.
But then doesn't Islamic law discount citizenship from non-Muslims? How are you finding similarities between these two systems?
So yeah, indeed, Islamic law doesn't care about nationality, right? So this is one way of conceptualizing how the racial boundaries are constructed in both systems. So in Islamic law, it only cares about religion, and that's it. And international law and international human rights law, to be specific, only cares about citizenship and not necessarily religions, but religions eventually come in indirect impact. So this was the basic finding. And then how one treats the citizenship and how the other treats the religion, the similarities were quite similar. Like the Islamic law was situated in a way that within Darul Islam, your leader cannot be a non-Muslim. And within international human rights law, political rights, Article 25 or ICCPR categorically states that all the executive and administrative and the legislative positions, they can only be held by the citizens of the state. So that's one of the...
Right. So if you find these similarities, the categories are based on different rationales, citizenship versus religious affiliation. But is it your claim then that these similarities should be used not then to criticize Islamic law as being outdated?
Indeed. I mean, I started this project as just a comparison to see who treats the other better and what one system can learn from the other. But there are some contingencies which I'm finding very surprising. I mean, we are living in a world in which we call ourselves progressive, modernized. Human rights law is something which is out of nowhere. It's a utopia, although some critical scholars are calling it a false utopia. But just to give one example, in classical Islamic law, the inclusion of refugees and the inclusion of those who were considered others, if they came to the Muslim leader, Islamic law mandates that the Muslim leader is bound to respond to their call, and that's it. And they will be included in the Muslim Dar Islam. Nowadays, we have international refugee law, which is very complicated. You have to prove prosecution. It's individualistic. The evidence requirements are very rigid. And although refugees are eventually included, but you can see the situation of Rohingya refugees. I mean, there's still no answer to that.
Mm-hmm. Now, I gather that you to make such a big topic more manageable, you're comparing two states, India and Pakistan. Tell us a little bit about India and Pakistan in that regard.
So indeed, Pakistan's constitution categorically recognizes that Islamic law is going to be the state law. So I started looking at what impacts, by saying that Islamic law is going to be the state law, what impacts does it have on Pakistan? I saw that those discriminations which classically existed against non-Muslims in Islamic law are a part of Pakistan, law of Pakistan as well, to a limited regard. But they are, like, for instance, we have a federal Shariat court, in which the judges can only be Muslims. The lawyers who are presenting the cases can only be Muslims. So this is one of the examples. For the non-citizen and the human rights law and the citizenship example, I'm using India as a case study. And if you know, India nowadays has this big, not necessarily a problem, it's something which they have self-created, in which Rohingya refugees and migrants are coming from Bangladesh to Assam, and the way they are treating them and the way they are changing their laws and the part of judges, it's quite surprising that how they are classifying the others and how they are treating them. So they became a very good case study for me.
Mm-hmm. I gather that you had an opportunity to ask an Indian judge when he visited England about the laws banning girls from wearing hijab in schools. We only have about a minute left. Can you quickly tell us that story?
Yes, indeed. So I think Justice Chandrachud came in King's College London, and his argument was entirely about the groups who are protected in India. And I just questioned him that it appears everyone is protected in India except Muslims in terms of citizenship. And there was not quite a positive response to that. I mean, I understand he's a judge, he couldn't respond them directly, but what happened afterwards was quite interesting. I mean, there was an Indian journalist who posted as that Indian judges grilled, and they mentioned my name, and then I received surprisingly many threats on my LinkedIn, which I didn't expect.
Well, we covered on the news that India is the source of the world's most Islamophobic tweets. Unfortunately, I wish I could ask you more about it, but we hope you're safe and that this research doesn't take you down a dangerous path. But thank you for joining us just for this glimpse.
Thank you so much, Katie, for inviting me. Thank you so much.
Thank you for watching. If you like what we do, please share and like and subscribe. Stay safe and God bless.